Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of Through Conversations podcast, where we explore the truth through conversations with the most brilliant minds. And today, in front of me is the amazing Bill von Hippel. Bill, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, my pleasure. Looking forward to chatting.
I'm honored, excited. You wrote a book which is paradoxically becoming one of my favorite ones, even though I haven't finished it yet. It's my homework, I promise you that. The Social Paradox. It's a great book about our evolutionary blueprint, about what's happening with autonomy, with cooperation, with our collective minds, with our autonomous, individualistic persons as well. But Bill, let's get the simple question up front. You discuss Toxoplasma gondii. It's a
Sure.
very simple question, right? What is that? By the way, it's my favorite parasite. But can you discuss why did you mention Toxoplasma gondii on the book and why is it so relevant for the whole social paradox conversation?
Well, Toxoplasma gondii is a really nice example of how evolution can have not just sort of anatomical consequences, like we evolved to change our shape and our size and maybe whether we have hands versus hooves, but also evolution can impact our psychology. And one of the interesting stories about Toxoplasma gondii is that this little virus, right, virus or bacteria? Now that I say that, I'm not even sure. I don't even know. Anyway, this little sucker, um, uh, it must be. It's a microorganism. So no, it's not a virus. Yeah, I take that back. Anyway, this little guy can adjust our psychology by working its way into our amygdala and then changing what we respond fearfully to.
Mm.
And so animals who are predated by big cats tend to be fearful of the smell of big cats. And one of the ways that you can tell if a big cat is around, like let's say a lion, is that you can smell its scat, its poop, or its urine. And so what Toxoplasma gondii does is it once it infects the herbivores that are part of its life cycle, what it really wants to do is get back in the gut of a cat because that's where it can then mate and produce new offspring that then the cat poops out and get into the grass and get accidentally eaten, and the whole cycle starts over. But of course, whoever eats it, like let's say it's some sort of hoof ungulate, like a gazelle or something, whoever eats it might just die of old age and get eaten by vultures or could get eaten by hyenas. And then it's a bummer for Toxoplasma gondii because it works so hard to get into its gut. And so what they do is they adjust by getting their little biochemical hands on the amygdala, they make the animal less fearful of the scat of these great cats who are their local predators. And so whereas an animal that's not infected will avoid, like if it smells the urine of a leopard, let's say, it will avoid that area. It'll leave immediately. An animal that's infected actually seems mildly interested in it and doesn't leave, which gives the leopard a better chance to kill it, which gives the Toxoplasma gondii a better chance to get back in the gut of a leopard. And so it's really nice how evolution is affecting our psychology. In this case, we're being manipulated, but in of course many other cases as well.
Yeah, it's wild because I read also, I'm serious, it's like my one of my favorite living organisms out there because when it does, when we have cats in our house, it seems as though we can become infected ourselves. And that
Yes.
leads us to, being less risk averse, like you say, with the example of the rats. They should shy away from, cat pee or, lion pee or whatever, but rather they get closer to it. And I read once that there was this correlation between people who had the Toxoplasma gondii in their brains and they were less risk averse, and a lot of them died in motorcycle accidents or were hockey players. So that was like mind blowing.
Yeah, those it's mind-boggling. Those kind of results are really wild, and they may well be reliable, but those are also the kinds of things that I really like to see replicated before we have any confidence in them. But it would be a super interesting consequence of their infection if you became more risk-seeking in general, right? And of course, we know that Toxoplasma gondii is also harmful to pregnant women, and so you want to be careful of cat poop.
Yeah, I'm honestly a dog person, so I'm
Yeah, same.
yeah, I can't. Uh, but Bill, you mentioned the word evolution, and your whole book is Social Paradox is all about our evolutionary blueprint, evolutionary psychology. And one of the burning themes while I'm reading your book is it seems as though, why I ask about Toxoplasma gondii is it makes me think a lot about free will Am I an individualistic person? Am I cooperative? Like, am I collective driven? That sort of thing. How am I? My genetics are influencing my day by day decisions. And at the same time, the burning question that I have always is, the end goal that you discuss in the book is reproduction. We're trying to reproduce. We're trying to pass on our genes. And so it's a really long question, but I would love for you to distill, our free will in terms of our evolutionary blueprint. Part one. Part two is this tension, this dance between being individualistic versus being cooperative, why we need both in our lives. And then thirdly, are we just evolution's conduit to reproduce itself? Like, is my goal only that in life? Because it seems like it's funny, it's ironic. I'm trying to have status, prestige, be, rise above the ranks, help my tribe, but at the end of the day, it's just to pass on life, which is, it's so funny. Hello, everyone, and thank you for allowing me to interrupt this episode. I have a huge announcement that I'll be sharing with you just now. My first book ever is out now, called The Time Is Now, a guide to honor your time on Earth. This was a 2-year project that's been in the works. It's a tough love guide to honor your time on Earth. This book will show you how to reclaim your time and energy for what truly matters. Click the link in the show notes and you're gonna see also the link to the domain here, timeisnowbook.com. Order a copy for your loved ones, and I'm so excited for you to dive into it. Thank you.
It is funny. That's a great set of questions. I'll do my best to remember them all as I work my way through them, but please remind me again if I don't finish.
Yeah.
So let's start with the free will and evolution thing. So first of all, free will is, of course, a raging debate. How much of our agency is actually free will, in the sense that we can literally determine an outcome above and beyond all the stimulated input on us, by which I mean our genes and our environment, our chemical balance, etc. And let's skip that debate for a moment, and we'll just talk about agency in the sense of what I want. And we will set aside the question of where does what I want come from, at least in the sense of, is my agency really free or is it determined? And so evolution clearly pushes us to want some things and not others. But that doesn't mean we can't push back. And there's a couple of very interesting ways that we push back. So first of all, as you said, reproduction is the currency of evolution. All evolution cares about, as far as me as an organism is concerned, is, do I leave copies of myself in the next generation? Half copies, because of course sexual reproduction. And if I do, evolution's happy, and is happy in the sense that it's I've done that which my genes push me toward doing. And if I don't, I become an evolutionary dead end. And it doesn't matter how wonderful or not wonderful I might have been, because my genes no longer exist in the next generation. And so, although of course there's complexities, I could help my nephews and nieces who also carry lots of the same genes. So, but if we set aside those details, there's a couple key issues here though. So first of all, you have to remember that we didn't evolve to want to have children. We didn't evolve to want to reproduce ourselves, because we didn't know how. We evolved to want to have sex, because that was a super reliable way to make sure that we reproduce, right? An ancestor 1 million years ago who wants to have children may not know how to execute that goal, but an ancestor who wants to have sex will end up with children, because of course there's no birth control. And so that leads to two interesting things. One is that what we really evolved is to want to have sex. And what we really evolved to do is want to have sex with the opposite sex, because that's the only reproductive consequence. But yet lots of people don't do that, right? And so you could either not do it because you decide to become a nun or a monk, or you could not do it for a host of reasons. So you actually can exert agency over one of the strongest desires that evolution gives us. Secondarily, we as a society then figured out how to make birth control. And so we can completely short circuit evolution's goals. It doesn't care if we have sex. It only wants us to reproduce. But sex was the way we got there. And now we can disconnect those two things. And one of the interesting things that you see is, now that we've disconnected those two things, now that we're becoming an urban species, more than half of humans live in cities, we're now starting to have smaller and smaller families, to the degree that humans are no longer even replacing themselves. And the current UN models suggest that somewhere later in this century, our population will peak and then it will start a decline. And it may be a permanent decline. It may be that we literally slowly disappear. I bet not. Neither of us will be around to see the answer, but I bet what we see is that as population gets small enough that it's more it's easier to have kids. It's not expensive. It has all these positive qualities and none of the negative costs of crowding and all the rest that probably will settle at some middle number of our species. But of course, who knows, right? We have complete agency over that. And so, although evolution pushes us to reproduce by having sex, first of all, we've solved that problem by having sex without reproducing. And then second of all, some humans decide not even to have sex, and some humans decide to have sex with members of the same sex, or all sorts of alternatives that don't lead to reproduction. So we can foil evolution when we decide to.
Wow. And it's
And
so much to
that's
say
kind of
there, but
part
let's
one,
get
right?
to part two. Yeah, let's
I'm
get to
sorry?
part two.
Okay. So remind me though, now I'm sorry, I've forgotten what was part two of the question.
No, this was brilliant. The second part is autonomy, cooperation, the whole
All
gist
right.
of like the social paradox. How does that play into evolution itself?
Okay, great question. So what I argue in this book, The Social Paradox, is that our two most fundamental needs are for connection and for autonomy. And so if you start with connection, when we separated from our chimp cousins about 6 million years ago and left the rainforest, we were suddenly exposed to all sorts of predators who weren't a risk for those of us who were still in the trees. And so one of the things that we evolved is a tight need to connect. And that need to connect is manifested in desire to form relationships, to cooperate, to spend time with each other. Now, chimpanzees also have desires to connect, but they're not nearly as strong as ours, and their cooperative orientation is not nearly as strong as ours. And there's many ways we can see that, but my favorite way is if we just look at our eyeballs. Chimps are clever enough to see where other chimps are looking, but they disguise that information by having brown eyeballs. There's no white sclera to their eyeball. And so when a chimp looks down to the left, other chimps can't really tell because it's all brown and it's hard to see. If I look down to the left, I advertise that to everyone in my group. And so what that tells us is that it benefits me for me to let you know what's drawn my attention, because whether it's a threat or an opportunity, you're going to help me deal with it. Whereas it also tells us that a chimp doesn't benefit by letting other chimps know the source of its attention, because they're likely to compete with it rather than cooperate in trying to deal with the threat or take the opportunity. So we evolved this very fundamental need to connect. This is what made us a success in the savannah, at least in the beginning, to survive, and then over time to rise back to the top of the food chain. But connection is not our only goal. We also have to stand out in the context of our group in order to attract mates, in order to get chosen to be on somebody else's coalition, in order to get picked to be part of the hunting party, to do all the things that we need to do to be a success in life. And so we also developed this need for autonomy, because autonomy allows us to sit back and decide, well, what do I want? And by that, I mean independence and self-governance. What do I want? What are my best chances of success? What do I enjoy the most, so that I know what I can pursue in order to become the most valuable to my group? So what skills can I develop? Can I become the best hunter? And so you and I go out hunting and I go, oh, Alex always gets the animal before I do. Okay, being the best hunter is not going to solve my problem. How about being the best arrow maker? And I start carving arrows, but Bob over there is a better arrow maker than I am. So I think, okay, maybe I'll be the best storyteller around the fire at night, because it's a very important trait that humans have, which is tell stories in order to pass on the knowledge they have. And maybe that's my strength, or maybe not, right? But autonomy is what allows us to pick and choose among the possibilities and then devote our energies to achieving those goals. And so they're the most two fundamental goals that we have. But here's the rub. Those two goals are in tension with each other all the time. To the degree that I go into relationships, I have to sacrifice my autonomy. I say to you, where do you want to get dinner tonight? And you say, oh, I really love a pizza. And I say, I was kind of looking for a kebab. All right, now we got to work out this conflict, and one of us has to compromise, or we go our separate ways in our relationship suffers. So there's a permanent tension between connection and autonomy, which is kind of a dirty trick that evolution played on us. To be happy, we need both, but we can't maximize both. We have to find some kind of balance between them.
Yeah, 100%. It's paradoxical because while reading the social paradox and while listening to you and I remember a quote that says, evolution is a mindless force, right? Even though the ultimate goal, it seems to be that it's creating life, it's driving us to be either autonomous or cooperative, working with our tribe or working on our own. But it's like the chicken and the egg question, right? Because if I'm trying to be autonomous, it's for me to stand out in some way in my tribe to find resources, and hopefully evolution gets its goal and I reproduce. But at the same time, you know, it can work also the other way around. If I'm collective and if I'm part of the team, that in itself, it's also like I'm autonomous. I'm standing out because I'm helping my tribe in a way. And so this leads me back into your first intervention, Bill, which was we're seeing at least in the United States, and you discussed this between collective societies and individual ones in your book, The Social Paradox, and it seems as though we're becoming more atomized right now. We're leveraging a ton the autonomous side of our equation, and it's driving us to a population collapse. I could say it's up to the point where we no longer cooperate as we should have or as we would in the past. So I would love to hear your take on that. And has the balance really tilted a ton into it's all about my goals, my status, my prestige, and that in itself has broken some of the social components of trying to serve our evolutionary blueprint?
Yeah, I think you're right. All sorts of forces push us toward autonomy in the modern world that didn't used to exist for our ancestors. And so urbanization, you might think, oh, that would make us more collective because there's so many more people around. But in truth, when you live in urban environments, you kind of ignore everybody around you, even your own neighbors in your own building, you kind of
Mhm.
ignore. And so people actually know their neighbors better when they live in the country than when they live in the city, despite having far fewer neighbors in the country and being farther apart. So urbanization pushes us toward autonomy. And of course, we go to urban centers to seek opportunity, which is something that our autonomy drives us to do. Education makes us more autonomous because the whole goal of education is just work hard, study, learn the material, and improve yourself. That's an autonomy goal. It's not a collection goal. In fact, what teachers do all day long is say, stop whispering to the kid next to you, stop passing notes. You're going to lose your recess privileges if you don't do your homework. And so they're pitting autonomy against connection, and they're trying to get us to be autonomous. Yeah, wealth makes us more autonomous. If you're poor, you need your neighbors, you need your friends because you rely on them to keep the boat afloat. You all cooperate and help each other. If you're rich, you don't need your neighbors. You can afford to have somebody take care of your lawn, take care of your house. You can hire out every service you might possibly need. And so as we get wealthier and rich and more urban and more educated, we start to become more and more autonomous. And then in my mind, the final nail in the coffin is technology, because now we really don't need each other. If I've run out of coffee and I see you on your porch next door drinking your latte and I really want one, I used to have to go over and say, hey, Alex, how you doing? Try to chat, see if you'll offer me a cup of coffee. But now I just get online, drone one in, and so I can do the internet and internet shopping and never leaving your home and working remotely. All those things, just every one of them severs connections and boosts autonomy, with the end result taking us exactly where you say, which is that we all become these little little, I'm not quite sure what to call us, but little autonomy machines doing our own thing, seeking our own satisfaction, with the negative consequence that we end up making time and time again, we choose to do things alone rather than with others. And so although every one of those little decisions makes sense, why shouldn't I drone in my latte? Why do I have to go over to your house and try to cadge an invitation for a coffee from you? That makes perfect sense. But the end result is I start to lose connection to you. And soon I don't even know you, even though you live next door to me.
And that's another paradox, right? Because one of the biggest paradoxes is we're living in quote unquote the best of times, right? We always hear this. We're like access to everything, one single click, and we can get
Yeah.
anything for ourselves. There's it almost feels like being ungrateful, right? Saying, yeah, would you rather live in another time, another age? And the metrics, when we think about metrics, yes, GDP and all of that sort of thing, we're kind of like improving health, that sort of thing. We have access to healthcare, but what about the intangibles, the ones that you discuss, like happiness, like community building, being part of something bigger, even religion in itself, which I will get to later on in the conversation. But how do we make sense of this? Because it's you know it's quite wild to think we have access to everything, but we're seeing these rates of depression, anxiety, even suicide among many groups of people, especially younger generations, Gen Z, my generation, millennials, experiencing this dissonance between, I have access to everything, but at the same time I feel lonely. I feel, I'm not part of anything, Bill.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's actually the question that sparked me to write the book in the first place. And so the the background story there was that I was visiting a friend of mine who I've known since we were children, and we were both, just growing up doing fine, but not wealthy or anything. And then he strikes it rich, and he's not just a little rich; he's super rich. And so he invites me over for dinner. I've always gotten together with him in random places, never at his own home since he made it big. And he invites me over for dinner, and I'm super excited to see like how did the super rich live, right? Here's this old friend of mine who's suddenly this new world, and sure enough, it's exactly like what you'd expect. I go into his massive apartment building, which is just beautiful, in New York City, right next to Central Park. And the cook is making dinner, and the maid is cleaning up upstairs. And it's just remarkable. And so I say to him, I said, "Man, your life is over the top." And he sort of laughs and he goes, "It looks that way, but it's really not." And he starts telling me all the problems he has that makes him unhappy and how he's not any happier than he was before he made it rich. Now, at the time, I have to admit, I felt kind of superior to him. I was like, ha, if I had that kind of cash, I would appreciate it. What kind of person can't appreciate this remarkable life that he's been gifted, right? Well, a couple of years later, I'm reading Frank Marlowe's wonderful book on the Hadza, who are some of the world's last remaining hunter-gatherers who live in Tanzania, right where humanity evolved. So they're a really wonderful group to study because they live in the same circumstances that our ancestors did, and they may even live similar lives. And so I'm reading about the Hadza who are nomadic. They're constantly moving along as water holes dry up or as the game move that they're hunting. And so they don't own very much. They have to be able to carry whatever they own. So they live in these very simple shelters that are exposed to the elements, hot or cold, rainy or dry. They're pre-medical society. They don't have modern medicine. And so they bury about 40% of their children before they reach adulthood, just like our ancestors did. They have no savings whatsoever for tomorrow. Every day whatever they hunt is what they have for dinner tonight. There's nothing else except for whatever the women dig up or gather. And the list goes on. They live these very insecure, dangerous, difficult, uncomfortable lives. And yet, when you ask, it turns out they're happier than we are.
And I'm excited to also announce that I'm going to open through conversations to a members exclusive section only, where you'll be able to access episodes earlier. I'm going to create so many perks for you that I'm excited for. I wanted to get the best value possible, and I've been thinking on how to do it. I want to give you access to early videos. I want to give you also access to when I record an interview, that you have access real time to just watch while we record, and also to have a live stream, meaning that you can tune in and ask your own questions, your Q&A to some of your favorite guests, and also some of the guests that you don't really know yet, but you would love to hear. And also that way you have some sort of skin in the game as you're supporting the podcast in some way and you're more invested in the success of it. And so I'm excited for this.
And so it suddenly occurred to me, I'm a multimillionaire compared to these people. I have amazing conveniences and wealth compared to them. But not only am I no happier than they literally seem happier than we are. And so suddenly that sense of superiority I felt when I was at my friend's house kind of evaporated. And I was like, I too am failing to appreciate this extraordinary life that we've been gifted. And then the question is why? What's gone wrong in our world that make us this kind of lonely, unhappy individuals when we're living easier lives than anyone has ever lived on this planet before us?
Yeah, and it's a lot. It's a lot. There's so many factors that you discussed right now. Education, urbanization. You go deeper into those on your book, The Social Paradox, and it's also from a younger perspective. From when I'm reading your book, I'm always thinking of what we're being. We're spending so much time on social media. Younger generations, I think all of us, but we're being thrown. The hustle porn, you have to always hustle, you have to make it, you have to grind all the time, zero in, no relationships, no friendships, just for 10 years lock in and then everything will come up, right? And we start living on this deferred life plan, because the ultimate goal is in 10 years, when I have all the money, when I have all the prestige, all of the status, I'll be able to attract a beautiful mate, a beautiful friendship. But in between those years, everyone starts doing their life, and all of a sudden you find yourself 10 years alone with a cash pile of money, and then what are you going to do with it? And so talk to me about social media. How do you see social media playing a role in this factor? But I also want to discuss more of like, how are we using social media ourselves to boost and boast about our, virtuosity, and I'm a worthy mate. I'm
Right.
finally I was honored to have my Harvard degree,
Right.
like you say on the social paradox.
Right. So that's a great question. And there's two kind of answers to that question. The first answer is that social media has introduced this unfortunate social comparison process that we just can't win. And so if we reverse the clock and go back 10,000 years and we're all hunter-gatherers, that means that we're spending our entire life in a small group of people. At any one time, maybe 20 to 50 people in our group, and there's a few hundred more that might come and go. So there's a small enough group of people that we basically know all of them. That means that I have a decent chance at being the best at something in my current group. I may not be the very best, but I'm probably second best arrow maker or storyteller or hunter or gatherer, whatever the case might be, kindest, tallest, whatever I'm after. I could probably get to the top or get close because my sample size is small. There's just not that many of us. But now we live in a world with a gazillion other humans, which in principle doesn't matter. But with social media, it matters a lot because no matter what I've achieved, when I get on Instagram, I can see people who've achieved more. They've got more money. They're more successful. They have more friends. What they're kinder. They're nicer. They're smarter, they're stronger, you name it, there's something compared to me. And so, whereas in the past we evolved in order to engage in the status game, choose our domain of interest, try to become the best we possibly could, and then engage in that status game by hopefully being just about the best, meaning we're not the best at everything, but we've got something that makes us valuable to our group. Well, now, no matter what that something is, we're not even in the top 100, right? There's just too many humans out there that we have access to. So social media is very costly in that sense. It hurts our esteem because status is a zero-sum game. It doesn't matter that I'm a super kind, smart, friendly person, smart, strong person, if you're a kinder, smarter, stronger person, right? Then I'm a schmuck. And so that's problem one. Now, problem two, you haven't gotten to yet in the book, but it's this acronym that I'm trying to introduce that I know is going to fail miserably because it sounds absurd, and I call it SMILSHing. Now, what SMILSHing stands for is social media induced laziness in our social habits. And the problem with social media is not that we use it to supplement our lives, but that we use it to replace our social lives. And so, if you imagine, for sake of argument, if I want to go out with my friends to a party tonight, and I'm trying to decide if I want to go, well, it's raining out, and it's kind of chilly, and I'm not quite sure who's going to be at the party, and if it's really going to be that much fun, forget it. Instead of even going, I'm just going to get on Instagram and or direct message my friends or whatever, because I know interesting things are happening there. And so the problem is that we actually start to spend more and more time alone because we're replacing face-to-face time with social media. Now, I actually think social media overall isn't a bad thing if you use it to supplement your social life. But the data suggests people are doing the opposite. And there's lots of evidence, but one of my favorite data points is this. If you look at people who are 18 to 25 years old right now and are single, so they're not married, and you look at whether they have had sex in the previous year and whether they have watched pornography in the previous year. After the introduction of social media, sex actually went up, and that makes sense because there's all these platforms whereby it's easy to meet people. But not long after the introduction of social media, it went back down to lower levels than it was before. And what that suggests is that there's no stronger drive than the drive for sex, but people are just less likely to go out where they might meet that person who really would have been that much fun if they'd just gone to the party. And what they're doing is they're replacing the drop in sex is matched by an equal rise in pornography, which is fake sex, right? You're not actually there involved in it. You're not actually socializing. You're just watching other people do it. And so in my mind, that's the sort of key evidence for this possibility of smilshing, of using social media to bring about laziness in your social habits and just not do the slightly high risk things that may not yield benefits, but that on average do.
Wow. Yeah, and it drives back to your point that, the biggest one of the biggest pleasurable things to do is, have being intimate with your partner and having sex, even like physical feelings, but at the same time we don't know that evolutionary incentive was to reproduce, not to always just feel that feeling. So they're like tied up. And I'm interested to know, Bill, what's your take on dating apps? What's your perspective on that? I think it's
Yeah.
it's an important point to have here.
So dating apps are both most things have costs and benefits, right? And dating apps are no exception. On the positive side, the data that we have so far suggests that people who form long-term relationships on dating apps, not hookups, but long-term relationships, when they form them on a dating app, they're more likely to last than when they form them in real life. And that's pretty remarkable. So if you meet somebody on an app, and you're looking for a long-term relationship, the chance of that relationship lasting is greater than if you meet them almost anywhere else, at a bar, at a club, at school, wherever. And we don't know why, but what the data suggest, or what I believe they suggest, is that it's simply a numbers game. Like, to find the perfect partner, it there's a lot of people that you meet that don't quite match you in what you're looking for. But if you use a dating app, well, suddenly there's a gazillion humans available to you, right? And so you can find that perfect partner more easily than if you happen to be in a bar and there's the six people available who are in your general category, or you happen to be at a health club or school or whatever. So on the positive side, for people who are trying to form long-term relationships, dating apps seem to be a real plus. On the negative side, they create this incommensurate reality for men and women that unfortunately doesn't work well together. Now, some of the differences between what men and women do and what work out perfectly. So just to take an example, on average, men are interested in slightly younger women and women are interested in slightly older men. So perfect. There's this age gap in most relationships in most countries on earth, and that makes everybody happy. But social media doesn't work that way. And the reason it doesn't work that way is that men live in a world of great inequality on these dating apps, whereby about 20% of the men get about 80% of the interest. And so if you're one of these really desirable males, all the women are swiping right on you. And but you're in the small group. And then if you're in the other 80%, hardly anybody is at all, if at all. So, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Well, it is for the 80%, obviously. But then what makes it even worse is that if you're women, well, they live in Denmark. So men are the equivalent of living in Peru or South Africa, very unequal society where a few have everything and most have nothing. Women, in contrast, live in Denmark, very equal society where everybody has interest. So almost all women get swiped by a fair few number of men who are interested in them. So 80% of the women get this interest. The problem lies, the incommensurateness is that despite the fact that women are getting a lot of interest, they're not interested in most of the guys who are interested in them. They're interested in this small slice of 20%. Now think about the reality of male psychology. If you're in the 20% and everybody's swiping right, what are your chances of forming a long-term relationship? Why should you? She doesn't quite love the same sports you love. Forget her. I'll move on to the next one because somebody out there is going to be the perfect match for me. And even if I may even just move on just because I like variety. Maybe you are the perfect match, but somebody else would be a perfect match and be brand new rather than same. And so the males who are getting all this interest tend not to form long-term relationships. They tend not to be ideal partners. They tend to be dating multiple people at once. And so the women who are swiping them are failing to find the long-term relationship they're seeking. And they're unfortunately not swiping the large number of males who would be very interested in forming long-term relationships, but just aren't of interest to them. So it's at this point, we're kind of stuck in this incommensurateness. Now, I suspect that disappears over time. We don't know this yet, but I suspect what happens is that people age out of this situation where they're only swiping these guys who everybody else is interested in because they start to see the value in these other men who are much more likely to form long-term relationships and, and make everybody happy. But right now, that's the state of play.
It's yeah, it's wild because psychologically it makes you also feel like it might be the perfect match, but I have so much optionality. I have all this pool of potential mates that why would I settle? And then all of a sudden you find yourself just uh, looking and looking and looking.
Yeah, and in fact, we see in real world pre-dating apps, we see the same thing. For example, relationships last longer in the country than they do in the city because every time I step out my front door in the city, all these potential matches, right?
Mhm.
And so why would I stick with my current one when there may be a better one out there? But in the country, I walk out the front door and I don't see many potential matches, and so I latch on to the one I got because that has real value.
And Bill, you also discuss success stories, of relationships. For example, you know, again, I want to bring back the autonomy versus collectiveness, teamwork versus just being individual. You discuss your friends who don't see each other at all, almost, but they're super happy together. Then you discuss other friends who are like always together. How do you find this perfect balance between, you know, you're in a relationship, so you're kind of sacrificing the autonomy part implicitly, but what makes it a perfect match in the sense of balancing these two paradoxes?
Yeah, so the answer to that question, I believe, is that everybody has a different balance point between autonomy and connection. Some people are kind of autonomy machines, and connection becomes secondary in their actual happiness.
Mm.
Now, there's reasons why our society pushes us to act like that, even if it's not true. But in reality, it is true for some people, and those people are more likely, on average, to be male. Some people are more connection machines, and so connection is really important to them, and autonomy is secondary. Those people, on average, tend to be female. But of course, if you find a highly connection-oriented male and a connection-oriented female, they're likely to, and if they are simpatico, they're likely to form a relationship where they're going to be together all the time because that suits both of them. Where you have the problems are when two people fall in love and one's kind of an autonomy machine and one's kind of a connection machine. And so the connection person is always wanting more time with the autonomy person who, to the contrary, doesn't want that more time. And so I think that relationships work best on average when both part members of the couple had the same desire for togetherness, are willing to sacrifice their autonomy for the same amount of togetherness. And of course, relationships can also work if it turns out you're lucky and you don't have to sacrifice your autonomy. And so if I say, gee, I love a pizza, you say, so would I. Or I say, I'd like to go rock climbing, you say, so would I. Then the beauty is you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have a relationship where you always want to do the same things. You can satisfy your autonomy needs, but your connection needs at the exact same time.
And I'm curious to know, what has your research yielded in terms of loyalty? Is the man more loyal or is the woman more loyal in a serious relationship?
Well, so it depends what you mean by loyalty. If you're looking at sexual infidelity as an example of disloyalty, then unfortunately men are very reliably around the world more disloyal. And there's reasons for that that make evolutionary sense. So women gain advantages when they have sex with men other than the primary partner if they get pregnant because now they've gained genetic diversity in their offspring. They haven't put all their offspring into the same genetic basket. So maybe their primary partner is really tall, and so all their kids are tall. That's great under most circumstances. But if there's a famine or tough times, a little person might be a better child to have. And so women will gain an advantage if they have multiple men who sire their offspring. But men gain that exact same advantage of genetic diversity, but they also gain a much bigger advantage, which is numbers. So if a woman has sex with 100 men in a year, she can still only have one baby. But if a man has sex with 100 women in a year, well, in principle, he could have 100 babies, right? And so because of that divergence in benefits uh, from diversity and from variety, men have a much stronger desire for variety in every society we've ever looked at. And there's interesting consequences to that. The first consequence is that the best predictor of infidelity in men is availability. If there's somebody who's interested that they find attractive, it's very hard. Men on average will tend to cheat. Now, you might say, but what if they're in a good relationship? Well, it turns out, this is depressing, but this is what the data show us. It turns out that male infidelity is uncorrelated with relationship satisfaction. So if they love their partner or if they're not that happy with their partner, they're equally likely to engage in infidelity if the opportunity presents itself. Now, women, in contrast, of course, also engage in infidelity, but it's highly correlated with relationship satisfaction. They tend to start having outside partners when they're no longer satisfied with their primary relationship. Now, mind you, this is monogamous couples. If you're in a different kind of relationship, these rules don't apply.
Wow. It is depressing indeed, but once you realize this, at least once, you know, you share it with us, your work is like, okay, we understand, our pitfalls, we can do something about it. We still have that sense of agency, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You don't, just because that's what happens on average doesn't mean you have to do it. It's not an excuse. Rather, you can think of it as a pressure to do something. But in the same sense that the strongest pressure evolution gives us is to have sex, basically. That's the strongest behavioral one. And some people choose not to. Or you could say eating. Some people go on starvation diets, Gandhi, to try to achieve political goals. People are remarkably capable of fighting their evolutionary urges. So they don't excuse your behavior, but they do provide us with an explanation. And then you, as the individual, have to decide, do I want to go with that flow on that one, or do I want to fight it?
In the social paradox, you write that psychologists haven't really found the reason why we fall in love. Do you care to speculate? Why do we fall in love, Bill?
I wish I knew. The thing is, we understand why we fall in love in the sense that it's the most successful strategy for raising offspring to adulthood is monogamous relationships. When when two adults work together in order to raise a kid, because kids are so effortful, they're much more likely to succeed than if only one adult. If we formed relationships like a lot of other animals, where the male's only job is to copulate with the female, and then he ignores the children. Um, those are animals that works well if you're wildebeest, and the day that a wildebeest is born it can run away from a lion or something, but it doesn't work well with humans, where the biological term is altricial. We're so dependent on our parents that one parent can barely do the job. It really takes two. And so the oh, now I've just forgotten where I started with this question. I'm sorry, what did you ask me again?
Falling in love, like you're
Oh,
speculating
yes,
why. Yeah.
yes. Thank you. So falling in love makes perfect sense because it causes us to pair bond, which is in the best interest of the children. There's other ways to look at this exact same question. So, for example, why do females conceal ovulation? If our closest relatives, the chimps, get this enormous swelling on their vagina, that is when the males are attracted to them. And when they don't have this huge swelling, the males aren't interested in having sex with them at all. So why do humans, not do that? We don't know, but what we believe the answer is that by disguising ovulation, she requires him to be sexually interested in her across the entire cycle, which means that he wants to be around her all the time, which means that he's going to provision her, he's going to bond with her, and he's going to help her raise the offspring. And so there's lots of evidence that falling in love in general is something that makes perfect sense and helps us as a species successfully raise the next generation. What we don't understand at all is why two humans fall in love with each other. So I can predict the chance that someone will fall in love with you by all your qualities, but I can't predict whether this person will fall in love with you or not. And that spark, when two people meet. And so you can swipe right on the dating app and then you meet them and you're like, eh. And so even though they look like they had all the things in their resume that are just what you're after in a partner, there's no spark, right? As psychologists, we have no idea why that is. None, which is too bad because it'd be super useful to know.
Yeah. It would be also like a great Valentine's card in a way. I'm no chimpanzee, but I fall in love with you. And so my 0.1% difference with the chimpanzees made me fall in love with you. Bill, I want to switch into politics, the hated
Sure.
topic, but you discuss it a bit on the social paradox, which is really interesting, and it tied up with a previous question I had for Professor David Voss, for Nicholas Christakis, I think Will Storr too. I always like this question that, you know, if genetics predetermine politics in a way, if our evolutionary code predetermines politics, and that ties up with religion. You discuss how religious groups lean into political preferences, and so I would love for our listeners to just hear your thoughts on this dance between, politics, evolution, and that sort of paradox.
Sure. So religion is a good example of how the environment also plays a role in politics. So we can come back to that, but let's set that aside for the moment.
Mhm.
Um, People's political leanings can be predicted to some degree, far from perfectly, by some of their most fundamental traits. And empathy is a really good example. So if you look around the world, people on the political left tend to be much more concerned about harms that other groups might be suffering because they're very empathic. And if I'm empathic and I see something bad happen to you, it hurts me. You can put me in a scanner and the same areas of my brain light up when you get your finger hammered than when I get my finger hammered. But if I'm not very empathic and you get your finger hammered, I'm like, oh, bummer. But it doesn't hurt me, right?
Yeah.
And so what that means is the more empathic you are, the more you tend to be on the left because the left tends to be looking out for other groups. Connection is their strongest value. And so all of us care about connection, but people who are more empathic care about it even more because if I can help you and make you not suffer, then I don't suffer either. And so what we see, for example, is women on average are more empathic than men, and they're more likely to be on the left than men. So there's lots of evidence that empathy really matters. Now, on the other side of the equation, remember I said we all care about connection, but we also all care about autonomy. Autonomy tends to be something that the political right cares more about. And so if you're on the right, your autonomy tends on average to be more important to you because you're much more concerned about individual rights. Can we structure a government where everybody can determine their own outcomes? Now, let's take an example of that. Taxation. taxation is clearly necessary in order to build bridges and roads and do all the kinds of things that governments must do. But governments also, at least in the modern world, take care of their citizens as well. And so in the US, for example, at least since the 1930s, there's been welfare. And what that means is that families that are very poor have a governmental source of income. That's increased over time. So that basically now a third of government income is spent taking care of people who don't have as much, either medically or with income protection or all sorts of other ways. And so taxation is a way to support other humans, but it also limits my autonomy. And so if they take my money away and give it to you because you don't have a job, well, then I no longer can choose how to spend my money, even if I might have chosen to spend it on you. And so there's this constant battle between the left and the right about whether taxes should be up and we should have a lot of social services, or whether taxes should be minimal and we have minimal social services. And that's really a battle between autonomy and connection. And so because men tend to be more focused on autonomy than women, they're more likely to be on the political right. But of course, there's a lot of variability within men and women, meaning that they're scattered across both parties as well.
Well, Bill, let's discuss the religious side of politics too, that we set aside for a bit.
Okay, sure. So religion is a super interesting one because, if we look at our ancestral religions, those that hunter-gatherers had when we first encountered them, sometimes hundreds of years ago, and still have it when we encounter them today, they're very different from our religions. So if we think of the modern religion in Western world, these monotheistic Abrahamic religions that began with Judaism and then led to Christianity and then led to Islam. And they all start with the same book, the Torah, the Old Testament, and then they move to the New Testament, and then they move to the Quran. And those religions differ dramatically from our ancestral ones in that morality plays an enormous role. Now that makes sense because these religions didn't exist in a hunter-gatherer world, but they started to exist in an agricultural world. And of course, hunter-gatherers don't need to worry about morality because they have so many social rules that determine morality, and they all know each other well. But once you become an agriculturalist and you start to live in larger societies that are no longer as cooperative with each other because of society no longer mandates those rules, then it's useful to have a way of enforcing morality above and beyond just the fact that we're strangers and you hope that you might be nice to me. And of course, monotheistic religions provide a very strong moral foundation that tells you the Ten Commandments. Here's the things you can and cannot do. Hunter-gatherer religions don't have Ten Commandments. They never do. And so the but those religions can then splinter in lots of different directions, and that becomes an interesting question. So, for example, if you look at Protestantism versus Catholicism, Martin Luther began Protestantism as a protest against the Pope and the idea that in order to worship God, you had to work through a human and an institution, the church. Martin Luther says, no, you can have a direct relationship with God yourself. And when you have that direct relationship, interestingly, it starts to be the case that, well, now if you think about it, it makes sense. God doesn't just care about what you do, but you have a direct relationship. He cares a lot about what you think as well. And so your thoughts start to become an important issue. And the thought control, not having immoral thoughts, becomes an important issue. But also, people become much more responsible for their own actions. And so, on average, Protestants tend to be much more about autonomy because you're responsible for your own actions. Therefore, if life goes well for you, that's a sign of a moral interior. If life doesn't go well for you, that's a sign of a less moral interior. And some of the Protestant sects even explicitly endorse that idea. And if you think about what autonomy means, that remember I talked about earlier being on the political right. And so you end up with the idea that Protestants are more likely to be, for example, the United States, more likely to be Republicans than Catholics, who are less about autonomy and much more about connection. So religion can specifically push you in different directions.
And in the modern world, it seems as though there's this new concept being called, oh, I'm gonna butcher it, but essentially it's like this secular monk, or like, this digital person who's like addicted to technology and to, programming and that sort of thing. But do you think that also is this lack of connection to religion, this decline that we're seeing, perhaps it's just right now it's trending upwards a bit, I think, but not that much. Is it related with our inclinations to being super, super autonomous?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. I can speculate that basically, if you look at hunter-gatherers, they all have religions, and their religions are all basically this kind of ancestral worship version where all humans are on a permanent, endless chain between the first humans who existed and the ones who are going to come next, and then we all play a role in that chain of life. And as once we die, we become spirits, and our descendants can pray to us and ask us for favors. And that's kind of what hunter-gatherer religions look like. And it makes perfect sense because so much of the world was inexplicable to them. Why did the lightning hit your hut and not mine? Well, maybe my ancestors looked out for you and yours were angry at you. I mean, we don't know, right? And we don't even know what lightning is. It sure looks like it came out, somebody threw it at you. And so somebody very powerful too. And so once science pushes back the bounds of the unknown so that the daily experiences that we have, earthquakes, rain and lightning, all the kinds of things that you can think of, catastrophes, once they are scientifically explained, lots of people then just don't need religion anymore. Now, that doesn't mean everybody doesn't need it. Tons of people are still very religious. But what it does mean is that religion no longer becomes mandated. It no longer makes as much sense for everybody. And so what I suspect is that as the world becomes more scientifically literate, some percentage of humans just loses interest in religion and becomes much more secular. Now, they can be like what you discussed, this secular monk, right? Which would be, from my perspective, connection is paramount, since that's a bad idea. But you can also be secular and connected. It's just modern religions have the advantage that they connect you to each other. You're meant to go to services. You're meant to do these things, which we know are actually very good for your happiness.
Yeah, it's a lot of the debate on whether or not we should continue believing in religions is this higher power that controls all of our destinies and whatever. But it seems as though it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy just to believe in religion. It can help us connect with others and also be more happy. There is a strong connection between religion and happiness and community, right?
That is right. And so if we look at the effect of prayer, for example, you can look in these representative samples and say, what is the effect of prayer on happiness of people who never go to services? You only look at people who never go to services, and you can see that prayer makes you happier than if you don't pray. And what that tells you is just believing in religion is associated with greater happiness. And I don't know why that is, but I suspect that life has more meaning if you're religious than if you're not. So not everybody who's not religious has a life that has no meaning. But some people who are not religious worry about the meaning of life and they feel like they're missing meaning. Whereas religious people never feel that way because religion endows your life with meaning. But you can ask the question a different way and say, well, let's look at people who go to services versus never go to services. And now you see that prayer may make you a little happier, but going to services makes you a lot happier. And it's a big difference, especially if you go regularly, like more than once a week. And that effect itself is even stronger if you've tended to separate yourself from the rest of the world. So for example, you can look at rich versus poor. And remember, I argued earlier that poor people are more interconnected with each other because they need each other, whereas rich people don't. They can hire everything out. Well, if you look at the effect of going to services regularly as a function of wealth, we see that it makes poor people quite a bit happier, but it makes rich people even more happy compared to what they were if they don't go to services. Now, the effect of going to services is so much larger than the effect of prayer because, of course, it's socializing, it's giving us connection. In fact, it's so large that poor people who go to services regularly are happier than rich people who never go at all, showing that, the small social manipulation, so to speak, you're doing it because you think you should, has a bigger impact on your life satisfaction than being wealthy and satisfying all of your material needs.
Wow. Yeah, that's one of the externalities, right, of religion. That at the end of the day, you're trying to connect not only with something higher, just you're connecting with other people around you with perhaps the same values, or the
Yep.
same kind of you're trying to find your people. And like you said previously, right now that we're so connected through the social media, and we have so many loose connections, which I don't know if we're gonna have time for this time around, but next time for sure. Is the loose connections give you more potential employment than your tight connections, but that's another topic in itself. But that I think it's the Dunbar's number, right? Like 100 people, we can only make meaningful connections to. Is it the
Well, yeah,
Dunbar's?
so Dunbar argued somewhere around 150 was what human beings are capable of connecting to. And I think that there's some general truth to that. But for me, I don't really take that number to the bank because if we look at hunter-gatherer societies, they never actually live in groups that large. On average, they almost never live in groups that large. They tend to live in groups that are smaller than that. And so the problem is that when you're in a group of 150, there tends to be a lot of bickering, and then people just kind of go their own way. So we're not really capable of getting along with 150 people at a time unless we're the one who gets to choose them. But then they don't necessarily get along with each other, if you follow me. And so the really what it comes down to in my mind is that what we all evolved to want and need is a smallest group of really close friends, and then a sort of larger group around that of people who we treat with kindness and they treat us with kindness, and they care about us and we care about them. And that's that loose connections that you were mentioning earlier. They're still of value to us. We're quite capable of maintaining that. But they don't provide the same everyday value, but they still matter. So when I go down in the morning to get my cup of coffee, I like to chat with the barista, and she smiles, and that makes me feel better, even though I only see her 3 minutes a day and just for a brief commercial interaction. It's kind of nice that she's always the one who's there. And if she's gone that day, it's not quite the same, right? And so even those loose connections do still matter to us.
Yeah, and it's, you know, I'm gonna get to it this weekend for sure, Bill. Part three of your book, which includes rebalancing, and it reminded me one idea, which was how does the giver and the receiver like affect the situation of like paying it forward, right? And I think that's also part of the rebalancing equation of how do we reconnect in the modern world? How do we intertwine these? One of the other questions was how much of our evolutionary blueprint uh, puts us in handcuffs, like locks us up in terms of unleashing our potential for others, but how can we use it as our springboard? How can we leverage our evolutionary blueprint to connect and reconnect in a modern world? So I think that's the biggest question that I have for you, Bill.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's the important one, which is, how do we, if we can identify the problem, if we can say, okay, we are becoming too autonomous, we are failing to connect, how do we fix that? And I'm more than happy to chat with you about what I regard as the best fixes, because in my mind, the key comes down to not trying to return to an ancestral past that we no longer have the time or interest in, but trying to leverage all the things that exist in today's world to get the positive benefits from them while trying to avoid the costs. And I'm more than happy to dive into that if you'd like.
100%. I'm all ears. Yeah.
Okay, so from my perspective, this is a point where we can leverage social media for good, but it doesn't have to be social media, because in the end, real life interactions are always the best. And so social media is way better now than it used to be. You and I are sitting probably 10,000 miles apart or something close to that. And yet I'm looking at you face to face. But it's not perfect. First of all, the bandwidth isn't ideal. And so sometimes there's a little bit of a lag back and forth. You'll notice you interrupt people, for example, more on the phone and on Zoom than you do in real life. But also it's not perfect in the sense that I feel like I'm looking you in the eyes, but you don't feel like I'm looking you in the eyes, because to do that, I'm not looking at the camera, I'm looking at you. And there's something about eye contact that creates its own bond when we have real conversations. Now, eye contact is super funky. We don't sit there and stare each other in the eyes. That just doesn't happen, except for lovers for brief parts of their time together. Rather, what we do is we have this delicate dance where we make eye contact and then we break it. We make it and break it. And if somebody asks you, how long do you maintain eye contact? $5 says you don't even know the answer. And yet there is an answer. And so I remember I was working with this autistic woman who was telling me that her biggest challenge is eye contact, because her friends always told her she's a super bright woman, but she doesn't understand eye contact. And her friends say, it's really weird, you never look me in the eyes. So she said, okay, no problem. She just stares them in the eyes, and they go, that's even weirder. And so that's like, well, what am I meant to do? And they say, you just stare for a little while. And so she told me this is what she literally does. She goes, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. And so because she doesn't know the rule, you don't know it consciously. You couldn't tell me how many seconds you maintain eye contact for, but you know it unconsciously. And you follow that rule, and it varies throughout the conversation. There's no set answer. There's no 3-second rule. It varies depending on what emotions are being shared, etc. And when it happens, pupils start to dilate in synchrony. There's all sorts of neural synchrony. It's super important, but it doesn't happen online, even in the best online platforms. Now, it probably will before too long, but right now it doesn't. And that's just one of many, many examples of why this sort of two-dimensional kind of contact that we have on social media is not quite the same. So that's a big caveat to say social media is great. It's way better than a telegram or even than a telephone was, but it's still nothing like real life. So whenever you can do things in real life, you should. But the key point that I would make is this: don't do things alone unless you want to be alone. So whatever you're doing, do what you want to do. That's what autonomy is all about. But do it with somebody else. And so let me give you, for example, before COVID, I used to love to do the New York Times, and my little sister loves to do the New York Times. But she lives in London, I live in Australia, so we're halfway around the world from each other. And of course, we can't possibly do it together, and we only talk every few weeks, even though I love her dearly, because she's a long way away and we're both super busy people. But once COVID hit and we're both sort of trapped in our homes, we thought, well, let's start doing the New York Times together. It's not that hard. We both open the app on our phone or our computer. And then she gets up in the morning and makes coffee and calls me and says, let's do the crossword. And then we kind of idle chit chat, but mostly we're just doing the crossword. But the idle chit chat comes and goes. So we're socially connecting, but we're both doing exactly what it is that we want to do anyway. Now, those kinds of habits are much more likely to last than if you try to do something you don't want to do in order to connect, or you put in all sorts of energy to connect that takes up time from your day. I do the crossword anyway. It's taking no more time to connect with her over the crossword than it is if I weren't. And so it doesn't matter what you do. If you like to paint or run or learn a new language, do it with somebody else. Ideally somebody you also know and care about. But if not, join a painting group or a running club, or just do it with other people, because unless you want to be alone, unless you need that alone time, which some of us do for some of the day, what we're doing is we're becoming alone more and more, and we're sacrificing connection in so doing it. And we do that because we're pursuing autonomy, but it's causing us to forego connection. And so the key is to not do that. And then the final piece of advice I give in this regard is you also need to make it habitual, which means that you don't decide whether to do it each time. It happens automatically. So if I'm a runner and I want to go running with other people, let's say I choose to do that every Tuesday and Thursday, then I just go running after my breakfast or after dinner or whatever the time is. That decision needs to be made in advance. Because if every day I decide, oh, should I run with somebody else today? Who am I going to run with? How am I? It just won't happen.
Yeah.
But if it's just a default that you and I go running every Thursday at 5 p.m., then I'm letting you down if I don't go. And so not only do I make sure that I do it, but I am actually probably even more likely to engage in my habit because I don't want to let you down and not show up for our weekly run.
Wow, yeah, it's creating that muscle memory and also that, holding each other accountable. And,
Yep.
I love the advice, and I say this in the best way. I'm hoping that this creating this routine becomes again like automatic, because
Yeah.
we're becoming so automized and so atomized as well, that we have to get these tips from experts like you, when back in the day it was just organic, but we're so caught up in, that automatic pursuit.
Yeah, so back in the day, you and I would decide to go hunting because we're more likely to be successful together. And let's say we're persistence hunting. That means we're running and we're just chasing some antelope, and we're going to chase him for about 4 or 5 hours in the middle of the day till it basically has heat exhaustion and we catch it and kill it and bring it home for dinner. And so, you and I are jogging along together. It's a much more fit version of you and I. So we're chatting away about life or whatever, right? We can do that and run at the same time. And we eventually bring down this animal. Well, we switch to a world where we hunt by ourselves. And all I'm saying is hunt together. Make it a default that whatever you're doing, leisure, work, whatever, that you try to connect with others at the same time.
Yeah, 100%, Bill. And just one last idea reminded me on the eye contact, which was,
Mhm.
I think I read this and I've been testing it out with, friends and also my girlfriend too, is when we're making eye contact, we have like one eye where we usually fix
Yes.
our eyesight. Like, it's so for me, it's usually like the right side. But then when you switch to the other eye, it creates like a more intimate, like, that connection. Is that something like evolutionary speaking? Like, why does that happen?
I don't know. It's a great question. I've heard others argue that as well, and it reminds me of this very cute scene from Moana. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie where this giant crab has captured her, and of course it's got these two eyes very far apart, and she's going back and forth, and it's like pick an eyeball. I can't concentrate. You have to pick an eyeball, and
Yeah.
we do all have a default where we have this dominant eye, and as a consequence, we look at one eye over the other. But you're absolutely right. It's for reasons that I don't understand, but seem to be true, switching eyes somehow makes a difference. It feels more weirdly intimate, right?
100%. And, it's so paradoxical. The social paradox is really paradoxical because it's this dance and this cosmic joke, right? Where we can't really maximize both, like you say, but we need both. We need that balance. And at the end of the day, you know, even you discussed LeBron James and Stephen Curry, right, in your book, and it's even them, even though they really leaned into their autonomous abilities, they had. I would bet my life that they would cite all of the community support they had, while trying to make that happen. So we need both. We need both to excel. And yeah, go ahead, Bill. You were going to say something?
No, I'm just agreeing with you. I think that the key thing that we need to remember, though, is that autonomy and service of connection is why it evolved. And so if you go off to be autonomous to become the greatest at X and then don't ever use that to strengthen your connections, you're missing the evolutionary bus.
100%. Well, everyone listening to this, really go into reading The Social Paradox. I'll make sure to also add wherever your social media connections, everything. Try to connect with Bill. Bill, let's have another round of this. Really, I truly
Sure.
enjoy
It'll be
talking
my
with you,
pleasure.
and it's been an honor. And so I'll let you know this weekend I'm finishing your book. It's a promise. It's a promise.
Excellent. It's nice to chat with you, Alex.
Thank you, Bill.